My name is Jennifer, and I'm 34 years old. Before everything started to unravel, I had a relatively stable life. I got married at 22 to a man I loved deeply, and we built a family together. We had a son, Anthony, who is now 8. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. We lived in a cozy home, had steady jobs, and everything seemed to be moving along as it should. The love and support in our family were strong, and I had a sense of peace that everything would work out, no matter the challenges we faced. That all changed 2 years ago when my husband Peter died in a car accident. I still remember the day the police came to our door, their faces grim, and my whole world falling apart. Peter was the love of my life, my partner, my best friend. His sudden death left a hole in me that I couldn't fill. I tried to stay strong for Anthony, but there were days when it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. I didn't know how to navigate the grief, let alone raise a young child alone. I stopped working after Peter passed. At the time, it felt impossible to balance a full-time job with being a single parent. I thought I could make it work, but the stress and emotional toll were too much. I wanted to be there for Anthony, to help him cope with losing his dad, and I couldn't do that while working a 9-to-5. So I quit my job, and we lived off the savings Peter had left behind, along with some survivor's benefits from his life insurance. But those savings weren't enough to keep us afloat forever. That's when my sister Rachel stepped in. Rachel is 4 years older than me, and we've always had a close relationship. Growing up, we were more like best friends than sisters, and even as adults, we maintained a strong bond. Rachel never married, never had children, but she's always been there for me, supporting me in ways I couldn't even begin to repay. When I lost Peter, Rachel didn't hesitate. She knew I was struggling, so she offered to help financially. At first, it was small amounts here and there, just enough to cover some bills or buy groceries. But as time went on and I found it harder to get back on my feet, Rachel started sending large sums of money. I was reluctant to accept at first. I didn't want to burden her, but Rachel insisted. She understood what I was going through, and she didn't want me to have to worry about money while I took the time to heal. She told me that she would continue helping out until I found a steady job and could support myself again. It was a huge relief, but it also made me feel like I was failing. I should have been able to handle things on my own, but I couldn't, and Rachel knew that. For a while, the arrangement worked. I wasn't able to find another job right away, but I was doing my best to keep up with taking care of Anthony. We started getting into a routine. The grief still weighed heavily on me, but I put on a brave face for Anthony. I tried to show him that life could still be okay, even without his father. But things weren't as easy as I hoped. It was a constant struggle to make ends meet, and I had to rely on Rachel more than I wanted to. I'd always been independent, and now I felt like I was losing that part of myself. Eventually, I did find a job, but it wasn't exactly the kind of work I had hoped for. I was offered a sales position that relied heavily on commission, which made it difficult to support myself and Anthony with any consistency. The paychecks were sporadic, and I never knew if I would make enough to cover everything. I didn't want to let Rachel down, so I asked her if she would continue helping for a while longer. She agreed, but I felt a deep sense of guilt every time I cashed the check she sent. I hated that I couldn't provide for Anthony the way I had hoped I would, but I had no other option. During this time, life seemed to settle into a new rhythm. There were good days and bad days, but we were managing. Anthony was growing up, and despite everything, I felt like I was doing my best to give him a stable life. Rachel continued to send money, and I continued to tell myself that things would eventually get better. It was hard to see a way forward sometimes, but I kept pushing. For Anthony, I would do anything. But even as things seemed to settle, there were cracks forming that I wasn't aware of. Cracks that would eventually lead to everything falling apart. I didn't notice at first, but slowly, I started to feel disconnected from Rachel. She had always been my rock, but now I began to feel like I was drowning in the weight of my own decisions. I wasn't handling things as well as I had convinced myself. I was overwhelmed by the guilt of not being able to provide for Anthony in the way I'd promised myself I would. I was ashamed of relying on Rachel, and the pressure was starting to show. I started spending more time away from home, meeting new people, trying to escape the constant reminder of my failure. I would go out more often, leaving Anthony with his babysitter or at my parents' house. At first, it was just to clear my head, But eventually, it became more than that. I met someone who made me feel alive again. I knew I was crossing a line, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to escape the overwhelming guilt and sadness that had been suffocating me. And so, I kept going down a path I never should have taken, all while pretending that everything was fine on the outside. I told myself it was just a temporary distraction, but deep down, I knew I was making choices that would have serious consequences. I wasn't being the mother I needed to be for Anthony, and I wasn't being the sister Rachel deserved. I wasn't being honest with myself, and I wasn't being honest with the people who cared about me. Little did I know, Rachel was starting to notice. It wasn't long before I realized my life wasn't the same anymore. The grief of losing Peter, combined with the overwhelming responsibility of raising Anthony on my own, began to weigh on me. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't escape the loneliness. Every day felt heavier than the last. I missed the life we had, the routine, the comfort, the stability, and I missed the person I used to be, the woman who could handle everything without feeling like she was drowning in her emotions. But now, it is different. After Peter's death, I tried to stay strong for Anthony's sake. I didn't want him to see me fall apart, but in truth, I was falling apart, piece by piece. The emotional toll was immense, and I began to feel disconnected from everything that once felt so stable. I spent more time alone, thinking about what could have been, wondering how I was supposed to carry on. To cope with the pain, I started seeking out distractions. At first, it was small things, going out with friends when I could, running errands to clear my mind, filling my days with anything that would keep me from facing the reality of my grief. But then, it became more. I started meeting new people, just trying to feel something different, something other than the ache in my chest. That's when I met him, the man who would change everything. His name was Alex, and he seemed like the distraction I so desperately needed. We met at a bar one evening, and I immediately felt drawn to him. He was kind, charming, and easy to talk to. For the first time in months, I felt seen. He wasn't asking anything of me. He wasn't expecting me to be strong or perfect. He just wanted to spend time with me. It felt like a breath of fresh air, and it was exactly what I needed at that moment. In the weeks that followed, our relationship grew. It started innocently enough, just casual dates, getting to know each other. But over time, I found myself thinking about him more and more. It became harder to focus on Anthony, on the life I was supposed to be building with him. My mind was preoccupied with Alex, with the way he made me feel, with the way he helped me forget, even just for a little while, the weight of my responsibilities. I knew deep down that I was neglecting Anthony. I wasn't as present as I should have been. There were nights when I would go out with Alex, leaving Anthony with his babysitter or at my parents' house. I knew it wasn't fair to him, but the loneliness I felt was so suffocating that I didn't know how to manage both my desires and my obligations. Anthony had already lost his father, and I was afraid of losing him too, but I couldn't help myself. The more I spent time with Alex, the more I found myself pulling away from everything else, including my own son. I didn't want to admit it, but it was becoming clear that I was putting my own needs above Anthony's. I started avoiding my sister Rachel more and more, not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't want her to see what I was doing. I didn't want to face the reality that I was letting everything slip away. Rachel had always been my rock, my support system. She had always been there for me, but now I felt ashamed to tell her what was really going on. I didn't want to admit that I was struggling, that I was choosing my own happiness over the well-being of my son. Every time I spoke to Rachel, I could hear the concern in her voice, and it only made me feel more guilty. She had been helping me financially since Peter died, and I could tell she was starting to notice that things weren't right. But I wasn't ready to face the truth. I kept telling myself that I deserved this. After everything I had been through, I deserved some happiness. But as time went on, I began to realize just how much I was losing in the process. Rachel started to ask more questions, noticing that I wasn't spending as much time with Anthony. She could see the changes in me, the way I was becoming more distant. But instead of talking to her about it, I withdrew even further. I didn't want to admit to her or to myself that I was failing as a mother. It was easier to pretend that everything was fine, to hide behind the facade of a new relationship, than to confront the reality that I wasn't living up to the expectations I had set for myself. I told myself that it was just a phase, that things would get better. I told myself that I would snap out of it, that I would find a balance between being there for Anthony and having a life for myself. But deep down, I knew I was in over my head. I knew that the longer I kept up this lie, the harder it would be to fix the damage I was causing. The worst part of all of this was that I could see the toll it was taking on Anthony. He had already lost his father, and now he was losing me too. I could feel the distance growing between us, and it hurt in a way that nothing else did. He would text me when I was out, asking when I would be home, telling me that he missed me. But I wasn't there for him, not the way I should have been. And it wasn't just Anthony I was hurting. I was hurting Rachel too. She had always been there for me, supporting me through the toughest times. But now, I was pushing her away. She had always believed in me, trusted me, and I was letting her down. I didn't want to tell her the truth, but I knew I couldn't keep hiding forever. Eventually, she would find out, and when that day came, I wasn't sure if I would be able to face her. In the end, I had to confront the reality that my actions were taking me down a dangerous path. But at that moment, I wasn't ready to change. I wasn't ready to stop seeing Alex, to face the consequences of my neglect. And as I continued down this path, I couldn't help but wonder how long I could keep up the charade before everything came crashing down around me. It all started to spiral out of control much faster than I anticipated. I had convinced myself that I could handle everything, that I could balance my life between Anthony, work, and my growing relationship with Alex. But the truth was, I was losing my grip. I was juggling responsibilities that were too heavy for me, and I wasn't handling it in a healthy way. My decisions were becoming more reckless, and I could feel the consequences closing in on me. Even though I tried my best to ignore them, I had been so consumed by the relationship with Alex, so absorbed in the escape it provided, that I stopped paying attention to the most important thing in my life, Anthony. I was slipping away from him without even realizing how much damage I was causing. The hours I used to spend with him, the moments I used to cherish with him, were now spent away from home. I spent more time at work, at bars, at clubs, with Alex. The distractions were easier to face than the reality of being a single mother, of being a parent who had lost her way. I told myself that it was temporary, that things would get better once I had sorted out my life. But deep down, I knew that I was lying to myself. I was neglecting Anthony. I hadn't even realized how bad it had gotten until one day, my sister Rachel found out what was really happening. It wasn't just that I was ignoring him emotionally. It was that I had let the most critical aspects of his life fall apart. Rachel came to me, concerned as always, and with her, the crushing weight of the truth. Anthony had been kicked out of school. I still remember the moment Rachel told me. I felt like the world had stopped spinning. My son, the one person I promised to protect and care for, had been kicked out because I had failed to pay his tuition. It wasn't just that I had been negligent, it was that I had let it get so far, had let it go on for so long without facing it. Anthony had told Rachel that he hadn't been going to school for weeks because of the missed payments, and he hadn't even told me. He didn't want to upset me, didn't want to make me feel worse than I already did. I should have noticed the signs, the gaps in his schedule, the missed classes, but I was too busy with my own life to see it. I had failed him in the most basic way. When Rachel confronted me, I couldn't look her in the eye. I wanted to lie, to say that it wasn't true, but I couldn't. The guilt weighed so heavily on me that I felt like I was suffocating. I had been avoiding Rachel for weeks, not wanting to explain myself, not wanting to admit what I had been doing. I hadn't been there for Anthony the way I should have been, and now it was too late to fix it. My sister was disappointed, but I knew I deserved it. Rachel was livid. She had always been the more responsible one between us, the one who could keep everything together, and seeing me fall apart was hard for her to accept. She had tried to reach out to check in on me, but I had pushed her away, and now she was angry. Angry at me for letting it get this far, angry at me for not putting Anthony first. She told me that I had let him down, that I was hurting him, and that I was being selfish, and I couldn't argue with her. She was right. I had become selfish. I had let my own desires and distractions take precedence over everything that mattered. The worst part was that, even though I knew I had failed, I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to admit how far I had gone off track. Instead of dealing with the consequences of my actions, I buried myself deeper in the relationship with Alex. It was easier to escape into that world where I didn't have to think about the responsibilities waiting for me at home. But even that was beginning to crumble. I knew that Alex wasn't the solution. He was just another way to avoid the pain of facing my own failures. Rachel's disappointment stung, but it wasn't just her reaction that hurt. It was the realization that I had been failing as a mother. I had put my own happiness above Anthony's well-being, and in doing so, I had hurt him more than I could ever explain. I thought I could get away with it, that I could have both worlds, a relationship with Alex and a life with Anthony. But the truth was that I couldn't. And now, the consequences were too severe to ignore. I wasn't ready to face Rachel's anger, but I knew that I had to. She had been there for me through everything, and now she was standing up for Anthony. She wasn't just mad at me, she was mad because she loved him too. And I had put my son in a position where he was suffering, where he was being neglected, because I wasn't paying attention. I couldn't hide from that. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening anymore. The worst part of all of this was that I had become the person I had always promised I wouldn't be, the kind of mother who neglects her child, the kind of person who takes the people who love her for granted. And I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to take back the time I had lost with Anthony or how to earn back Rachel's trust. I didn't know how to fix the damage I had caused, not just to myself, but to the family that had always been there for me. At that moment, I realized just how deep I had gotten into a hole I couldn't crawl out of. It was too late for simple apologies or excuses. The decisions I had made, the way I had let my life spiral out of control, had hurt the people I loved the most. And now, the consequences were here, staring me in the face. The worst part was that I knew, deep down, that I deserved every bit of it. The moment Rachel found out everything, I knew there was no way I could justify my actions. I could see it in her eyes when she confronted me. The disappointment, the hurt, and the disbelief. I hadn't even seen it coming. I had been so consumed with trying to escape the reality of my situation, so desperate to fill the empty spaces in my life, that I had ignored the signs of the people around me noticing. But Rachel was different. She knew me too well. And when she found out, she didn't hesitate. She took matters into her own hands in a way that I never expected. I found out that she had hired a private detective to track my movements. It hit me like a ton of bricks when she told me. I was furious at first. I felt betrayed, like she had no right to invade my privacy. I didn't think she would go to such lengths, especially after everything we had been through. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like all the cracks in my life that I had been trying so hard to hide had been suddenly laid bare. The guilt I already felt was only amplified by the fact that she had seen everything I had been trying to keep hidden. At first, I didn't want to hear it. I tried to deny it, tried to convince myself that what I was doing wasn't so bad, but Rachel wasn't backing down. She told me she had seen enough to know that I wasn't living the life I should have been. Not for myself, and certainly not for Anthony. It was painful to hear, but I knew deep down that she was right. She didn't just stop there. She reported me to Child Protective Services, CPS. I had no way of defending myself anymore. The truth was out there, and I couldn't hide from it. As I listened to her, as I heard her tell me how worried she was about Anthony, something in me cracked. I couldn't look her in the eye anymore. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to admit that I had failed, not just as a mother, but as a sister, as a person. The emotional wall I had built to protect myself from the guilt and shame of my actions suddenly seemed like it was falling apart. I had hurt the people I loved the most, and now there was no escaping it. I couldn't argue with her. I couldn't defend myself. I didn't have the strength to even try. I knew, on some level, that Rachel was doing this because she cared about me, because she loved me and wanted what was best for me. But the way she handled it, the way she took matters into her own hands and went straight to CPS, made me feel like I was being pushed into a corner, forced to confront everything I had been avoiding for so long. I should have been grateful for what she did. After all, Anthony's safety and well-being were at the heart of it, and Rachel was doing what she thought was best for him. But instead, I was angry, hurt, and embarrassed. How could I face anyone now? I had become someone I didn't even recognize. The person I used to be, the person who was strong, responsible, and able to handle things, was gone. And in her place was someone who was so caught up in her own desires that she was willing to let everything else slip through her fingers. When I heard that CPS had started an investigation into my behavior, it hit me harder than I expected. I knew it was coming, but I didn't realize how much it would affect me. The reality of losing custody of Anthony became so much more real. I had let my emotions cloud my judgment, and now I was paying the price. The thought of not being able to see him every day, of not being there for him in the way he needed me, terrified me. But deep down, I knew I had brought this upon myself. I had failed him. Instead of facing the situation head-on, I ran. I continued to avoid confronting the truth about what I was doing. It was easier to keep living in denial, to keep pretending that everything was fine. I didn't want to look at the consequences of my actions. I didn't want to admit that I had let everything slip out of control. So, I kept going, keeping myself busy with Alex. The distraction I had let become too important in my life, but things weren't the same anymore. I couldn't continue ignoring the reality of the situation, no matter how much I tried. I had made choices that affected Anthony's life, and now there was no way to undo the damage. Rachel wasn't going to let me keep hiding from it. She had taken the first step in making sure Anthony would be safe, even if it meant that I had to be confronted with the truth. I remember when Rachel told me about CPS getting involved. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she didn't understand, that she didn't know how hard it was. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew she was right. I knew I had messed up, and I knew that there was no going back, but I still didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to undo the damage I had caused, not just to myself, but to Anthony. I had let him down, and now I was facing the very real possibility of losing him. The thought of it made my stomach churn. The guilt gnawed at me every day, and the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it became. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I couldn't keep pretending that I was the mother I used to be. I was still avoiding the most important conversation, though. I couldn't bring myself to talk to Rachel about it. I couldn't admit that she was right, that everything she had said was true. I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud, to say that I had failed and that I was scared of losing my son forever. So I kept running from it. I kept running from the truth, hoping that somehow things would get better on their own. But I knew better. Deep down, I knew things wouldn't fix themselves. The consequences of my actions were already unfolding, and the only thing I could do now was face them head on. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. When CPS intervened, I knew my life was about to change forever. They placed Anthony in Rachel's care temporarily while they conducted their investigation. The moment I heard that my son was no longer with me, I felt a rush of anger and disbelief. How could this be happening? I was his mother. He was my responsibility. But as the reality sank in, I knew there was no one to blame except myself. I had made decisions that had led to this point. I had failed as a mother, and now I was paying the price. The anger I felt was complicated. On one hand, I was angry at Rachel for being the one to step in, for being the one to take Anthony away. It felt like a betrayal. She had always been my sister, my support system, but now she had done something I couldn't ignore. I wanted to scream at her, tell her she had no right to take him from me. But deep down, I knew why she did it. She did it because she loved him, because she saw what I couldn't. I had let my own desires cloud my judgment, and now Anthony was suffering for it. But the worst part wasn't just Rachel's decision. It was the way my entire family turned against me. My parents, who had always been my safety net, who had supported me through thick and thin, suddenly felt like strangers. They sided with Rachel, accusing me of neglecting my son. They didn't understand. They didn't know how hard it had been for me since Peter died. They didn't understand the pain I was in, the loneliness, the way I had tried to fill the void in my life with someone, anyone, who could make me feel something other than the crushing weight of grief. My parents began to criticize me relentlessly. They said I was too harsh on Rachel for stepping in. They told me I should have talked to her before letting things go this far. They claimed that I hadn't even tried to fix things, that I hadn't made an effort to communicate with Rachel or ask for help before everything fell apart. But I was drowning. I was so deep in my own misery that I couldn't even see how badly I was hurting my family. I couldn't see that Rachel was only trying to protect Anthony, to give him the stability I couldn't. It felt like I was being torn apart. My parents told me I was selfish for not understanding their position. that I hadn't taken into account how much I had hurt Rachel by not being there for Anthony the way I should have. They made me feel like I was a bad person, like I had let down everyone who loved me. And maybe they were right. Maybe I had let them all down, not just Anthony, but Rachel too. I couldn't even stand to look at myself anymore. The guilt was suffocating. Every conversation I had with them felt like an attack. They reminded me of all the times I had failed, all the moments when I could have done better, when I should have made different choices. They accused me of being emotionally distant, of letting my grief consume me and shutting everyone out. And they were right. I had shut them out. I had pushed them away when I needed them the most. I thought I could handle it on my own, but in doing so, I had ruined everything. What made it worse was that I couldn't fight back. I didn't have any defense. What could I say? How could I justify my actions when I knew they were wrong? I had failed as a mother, and no amount of excuses would change that. All I had left was my shame, and even that felt like it wasn't enough to make me face the truth. The worst part was that I couldn't go back. I couldn't undo what I had done. My family had already made up their minds, and there was nothing I could say to change it. I had lost their trust, and it felt like I had lost them entirely. They didn't look at me the same way anymore. They saw someone who was irresponsible, someone who was weak and selfish. I had become the villain in my own story, and I didn't know how to fix it. I was completely isolated. Rachel, my parents, they all turned away from me. They couldn't understand why I hadn't fought harder for Anthony, why I hadn't done everything in my power to be the mother he needed. I was too lost in my own world, too consumed by my own pain, to see what was happening right in front of me. And now, it was too late. The damage was done. The loneliness was unbearable. I had always been close to my family, especially Rachel, but now I felt like a stranger. They were all disappointed in me, and I couldn't even blame them. I had disappointed myself. I had let my son down in the worst possible way, and now I was paying the price for it. I couldn't change what had happened, and no matter how hard I tried to fix things, I knew it would never be the same. My relationship with Anthony was damaged, and so was my relationship with my family. In the weeks that followed, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make things right. I tried calling Rachel, trying to explain myself, but she didn't want to talk to me. My parents were just as distant. Every time I tried to reach out, it felt like I was pushing them further away. I couldn't bear the thought of losing them all, but I knew that I had to live with the consequences of my actions. I felt like I had lost everything: my son, my family, my own sense of self. I was alone, and the worst part was that I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to make it right. I didn't know if there was even a way back from the mess I had made. The anger, the guilt, the shame, they all consumed me, and I didn't know how to escape. All I wanted was to go back to the way things were, to fix the mistakes I had made, but I knew that was impossible. What I had done could not be undone. At that moment, I realized that my life would never be the same. I had burned so many bridges, and I wasn't sure if I could rebuild them. I couldn't blame anyone else. I had done this to myself. I had lost my family's trust, and it felt like I had lost the chance to ever fix things. It wasn't just Anthony I had to answer to. It was Rachel, my parents, and myself. And I wasn't sure if I could ever make peace with what I had done. The day the court made its decision felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. My heart sank as the judge announced that Anthony would be placed in Rachel's permanent custody. I had hoped in some small part of me that the court would see that I could still be a good mother, that I could somehow make things right, but I knew deep down that the damage was done. My actions had caught up with me in the most devastating way possible. The court's ruling wasn't a complete loss for me, though. I still had supervised visitation rights, meaning I could spend time with Anthony under the watchful eyes of a caseworker. But the sting of hearing that my son, my flesh and blood, was being taken away from me was unbearable. I could barely process the words. It felt like a weight was crushing my chest, and no matter how hard I tried to breathe, it wouldn't lift. I was devastated, but I knew I had no one to blame but myself. I tried to convince myself that it was for the best, that Rachel would give Anthony the stable home I couldn't, but that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. I couldn't understand how I had let it get to this point. I used to be so sure of myself, so confident that I could be a good mother, and now, here I was, unable to take care of my son, unable to fix the mess I had made. I had failed him in every way possible, and there was no going back. Rachel had done everything she could to ensure that Anthony had a better life. She took on the responsibility of caring for him, even though I should have been the one to step up. And now, she was doing what was best for him, even if it meant taking him away from me. I couldn't blame her. She was doing what was necessary to protect him, to give him a chance at a normal life, but it felt like she was taking away everything I had left. She had become the one who could give Anthony everything I couldn't. She was the one who could offer him stability, support, and love without the distractions I had let take over my life, and I had no one to blame but myself for that. As the weeks passed, and I had to adjust to the reality of the situation, I couldn't stop thinking about how much I had lost. I thought about Anthony all the time, about the way his eyes would light up when he saw me, the way he would run into my arms for a hug. I missed him so much it hurt. But what hurt the most was knowing that I had driven him away, that I had let my own selfishness and distractions come before him. I had chosen the wrong path, and now I was paying the price. I tried to focus on the supervised visits. I would see Anthony for a few hours at a time, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't the same. We used to spend our days together, just the two of us. Now I was limited to brief moments, watched by a caseworker, making sure that I didn't mess up again. I hated it. I hated that I had to prove myself worthy of being his mother, that I had to fight for the right to spend time with my own son. But even though the visits were painful, they also gave me something to hold on to. I knew that I had to keep trying, that I had to make changes if I ever wanted to rebuild my relationship with Anthony. I couldn't expect him to come back to me just because I wanted it. I had to show him that I could be the mother he needed. But how could I do that when I had already lost so much? How could I fix what was broken when I didn't even know where to start? The worst part was the shame. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. I had failed Anthony in the worst way possible. I had neglected him, emotionally and financially, and had put my own desires before his well-being. And now, I had to live with the consequences. I had lost him. I had lost his trust, his love, and his respect. And I didn't know how to get it back. I couldn't even begin to think about how to repair my relationship with Rachel. She had been my pillar, the one person who had always supported me, and now I had betrayed her too. She was doing what she thought was best for Anthony, and I couldn't fault her for that. But the guilt of knowing that she had to step in and take control of a situation I should have handled broke something inside of me. She had taken on the role of mother for Anthony, and I had no choice but to accept that. I couldn't change what had happened. All I could do now was try to be a better person, a better mother, even if I wasn't sure how to begin. There were days when I would cry, when I would think about how much I had lost, and wonder if I could ever get it all back. But the truth was, I knew that I couldn't. I couldn't turn back time and make different choices. I couldn't undo the damage I had done. All I could do was move forward, even if I didn't know how. In the end, I had to face the painful truth. I had failed Anthony. I had failed myself, and I had to learn to live with the consequences of my actions. It wasn't fair, but it was my reality. The only thing I could do now was try to become the person I once was, someone who could be there for Anthony, someone who could give him the love and stability he needed. But it was going to be a long road, one that I wasn't sure I was ready for. And the hardest part was knowing that, no matter how much I tried, I couldn't change the past.